Hello and welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study, both those in the in-person class on Sunday morning and those that might be connected virtually. We continue in our introductory series to the book of Revelations of the New Testament. Some Bible title the book of Revelations as Apocalypse rather than using the word Revelation. We have covered much of the introductory material needed in this series, but a few critical topics remain before we address chapter and verse. One of those is, what is an apocalypse? The oldest surviving manuscripts of the book, when translated into English, are entitled The Apocalypse of John, or some of those older ones will add the Evangelist John, either before or after the word John. Revelation is an English word for the Greek word apocalypse. In religion and theological circles, it is the English word for disclosing some form of truth assumed to be from God. The revelation of St. John of the Divine was a title used in 1611 original English King James Bible. By the way, that Bible had 80 books, 39 of the Hebrew Old Testament, 14 in the Apocrypha, and 27 in the New Testament. Those Apocrypha books have a lot of apocalyptic stuff in them. However, the Apocrypha books were removed from most Protestant Bibles during the 1800s. Yet the Apocrypha books were in the Greek Septuagint that was used widely by both Jews and Christians in the first century AD, when this book of Revelations, they believe, was written and the Christian faith was founded. Thus, Protestants generally have missed the evolving apocalyptic philosophy that is espoused in this book of Revelations, which is the philosophy driving the last half of Daniel and the book of Revelations itself. That's what scholars tell us. Most of the Apocrypha books were thought to have been written between roughly 200 BC and 100 AD, with a few later. Some of that Apocrypha literature is based on apocalyptic eschatology. Eschatology means towards the end of time, or looking towards the end of time. While apocalypse deals with revealing or exploring that in the context of the apocalyptic philosophy being in vogue at the time, which, by the way, assumed that the current reality was that evil is in charge of this world, while there is hope that there is a God who will soon and ultimately resolve that dilemma, eliminating evil and reestablishing a world of justice where the believer's style of life will be there. Thus, a form of dualism had entered the monotheistic paradigm during Persian rule, and they were trying to deal with it while holding to the one and all-powerful God mindset. But what was going on around them suggested God was not currently in charge. We saw in Ezekiel, for example, when we studied it a few years ago, that he had to teach them that God was not just confined to that temple, but that God was with the Jews wherever they were, in Babylon specifically at that time. Yet, evil was ruling. We must appreciate that most of the Old Testament books are not written with a dualism and or multiple God mindset. Instead, the Old Testament mainly deals with laws, history, and religion of the ancient Israelites and early Judean faith, while they rule themselves or early on in the diaspora after they were dispersed. Therefore, the Old Testament does not have much apocalyptic thinking, the exception being the last 6 chapters of Daniel and that short section in some of the prophetic writings, which developed post-Israel and post-Judah nations. Modern scholars say the first half of Daniel surfaced between 400 and 300 BC, and the last half reflects the situation found during the Maccabean revolt, which occurred about 167, I think, BC. There was strong apocalyptic activity that developed then under this heavy-handed Hellenization of the Jewish society that was developing. And the Jewish people, led by the Maccabees, rebelled against it. But it does not become the temple or mainline theology that is apocalyptic thinking during this time. Dr. Craig Koester of Lutheran Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota, teaches that we moderns, upon hearing or reading the word apocalypse, conjure up the image of a cataclysmic disaster ending the world, such as nuclear Armageddon. But the word relates to giving insight into mystery. Thus, what is the mystery revealed in Revelations is what this book is all about. Philosophers teach that Revelations is an apocalyptic writing that revolves around 2 basic mysteries. Those mysteries are the nature of evil and the nature of hope. Those have confronted humankind across all geographies, religions, and times since then, or since the beginning. In the case of Revelations, Dr. Amy Levine, an Orthodox Jew by faith, but teaches at New Testament at Vanderbilt University, and she's a well-known scholar in this area, that the foundation laid out by the late Hebrew prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, are being used in Revelations. Those Old Testament prophets were not concerned with predicting the future, she says, as much as they were trying to communicate divine will. They were in debates, actually, she says, with the kings and priests in order to shape the lives in the present, in their present world, towards sustaining the faith and belief in the one God, and not turning towards man-made beliefs, corruption, brutality, evil injustice, and so forth. And this was especially happening during the breakup of Israel and Judah, and early on in the diaspora. It was a time when much foreign influence was also present in their society, and that foreign influence increased, as well as it was placing much pressure on their faith and how they needed to adopt yet sustain their core faith, values, and culture. John in Revelations is using that same approach, she says, in his time and place in the realm that evil abounds. But the Christian must sustain hope that God is present and sustain their faith that God's plan of intervention involves Jesus Christ and them. God's plan has already begun, but it is a process, was the teaching of the Apostle Paul. Evil still rules, however, in the present time of all that happening, until the sovereign, who is God, ultimately takes full and final culminating action to destroy evil in all forms. The writer is trying to demonstrate that good still wears the white hat in a black hat society, but good is hopeless and helpless against evil on its own. Only God has sufficient power to overcome, neutralize, and destroy evil at its roots. Humans cannot do it on their own. Moreover, human nature at the core is actually fond and desirous of much of what evil brings, or at least places a priority on it above good. Thus, the writers of apocalyptic texts, like Revelation and Daniel, are trying to give their audience confidence to stand with and sustain their faith and value system during times in which they may likely die because of their actual faith. They make the point that it is only those who do sustain to the end that should have hope of being on God's side in judgment. Although they write for the near future, it is not necessarily the individual's immediate future for all, as the end is not likely in all of their lifetime. Because some of you, the point is always made by them that some of you will die at the hands of evil due to your actual faith. The motivation, therefore, is that the knowledge that evil will be ultimately overcome, justice prevails, and that God will make the world anew without the influences of evil. That is the driver for those who are faithful to the end, as they will populate that new evil-free world that God develops. Christianity has a foundation built on an apocalyptic faith concept. Jesus, John the Baptist, and his disciples were apocalyptic Jews from the Galilean area. However, apocalyptic traditions were not there in the old traditional Israelite Jewish religion. Instead, it begins to emerge, scholars teach, as a minor thought in the 5th century BC when they were under Persian rule. The new idea was sharply different from the Mosaic and prophetic traditions in vogue at the time, but strongly suppressed in Judea, in the area where Jerusalem was. Over the next several centuries, apocalyptic thinking increases in Judaism, but did not dominate at Christ's time by any means. One group that practiced it during that time were those responsible for what we call the Dead Sea Scrolls writings. They were a minor sect of Judaism that withdrew from normal Jewish society sometime in the 2nd century BC, well before Christ, and survived until about mid-1st century AD, when they were destroyed by the Romans in the Jewish-Roman War. They wrote of the conflict between good and evil in humans, and that a demonic, satanic force operated in the world to collect people under its influence and way of life. Human nature cannot overcome it, they taught, but only God can take it away and ultimately bring about the needed change. Until then, their belief was that they must live in a separate and isolated life from the rest of society, from their Jewish society, that is. They are preparing for the end while doing their best to practice what they understood was God's will. Dr. Kuster and others report that the classic paradigm that emerges in apocalyptic Jewish circles consisted of 2 ages. The present one ruled and dominated by evil and Satan. that leads to a permanent death, and a new age in which God's rules of good and righteousness will apply to all. For that to happen, God will have to act to fully eradicate evil. Death will occur to all, and a resurrection of the righteous into a new age and life occurs. That's in essence the paradigm. Where did this idea of a resurrection suddenly come into Judaism? Clearly, that was not in the old Israelite tradition. We see in the New Testament that the Sadducees, who were the ones who actually ruled the temple and ran the Jewish religion at Christ's time, clearly rejected this idea of resurrection, while the Pharisees believed in a resurrection of the dead. This idea of a resurrection came into Judaism through and with the strong Hellenization by the Greeks. The Greeks believed it and taught it to those they ruled. Some Jews accepted it, and that changed their paradigm. I hope this helps you get some understanding of the apocalyptic concept that is underlying the book of Revelations and other apocalyptic literature, as we are not too far from getting ready to start our chapter and verse reading and study of Revelations. Hope you have a good week.